Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Easy Peasy with the Smithsonian. I'm Allison Leitner. I'm an instructional designer here at the Smithsonian, and I'm here with my colleague, Ashley Naranjo, as well as Jim Reese and Jaime Chao Mignano from the Washington International School. So today, as we continue in our series, we will continue modeling routines from Harvard's Project Zero. As I said, these have often been done in person, but we're kind of trying to show you how they can also be a powerful tool for online learning as well. Jaime and Jim will go ahead and they'll model the routine out, and we'll ask for your participation in the chat, and then we'll take some general questions at the end if you have them. So in the spirit of modeling, we'll start with our socio-emotional learning opener, and we'd like you to use the chat to think about what is the role of perspective in art. All right, and Jaime and Jim, I will turn it over to you.
Great, thank you, Allison. And Ashley's gone behind the scenes, and she'll be working the screen for us, but she'll come back a little bit later. My name is Jim Reese, as Allison said, and I work at Washington International School, and I direct the Professional Development Collaborative. And we were together with Jaime on Monday using the routine that she's going to model today with a practice from Agency by Design, which is a project or initiative at Project Zero that really looks at the promises and practices and pedagogies of maker-centered learning. And we have a project that's an offshoot of that here in DC that's called Making Across the Curriculum. And Jaime and I have been on the leadership team of that project since its inception in 2018. And what we're looking at, it's ongoing research and professional development. And what we're looking at is practices that have to do with making or hacking or taking apart, but also looking at the design world, and then also looking at the role of design and these maker practices within systems. And that's what we're focusing on in these two sessions that Jaime is going to be leading. And what's led us to get really excited about this work on systems is that as we examine systems, then we also build that agency that might help us hack those systems or improve those systems, make them better, make them fairer, more equitable. And I think we'll get into some of that today with Jaime. We certainly did to a certain extent on Monday. And so with that, I'm going to introduce Jaime Chao Mignano, a dear colleague from Washington International School, to get us started.
Thanks, Jim. I'm really excited to be introducing Agency by Design and a Project Zero thinking routine kind of together and utilizing the strengths of each of them. We're going to be working with Zoom In, which is a thinking routine that helps us look closely. And we're going to be using an Agency by Design protocol called Voice and Choice, which helps us examine what's there and maybe what's also missing in an artwork or a designed object. Both of these work really well with additional time, of course. More time than we have here today, especially because it can always be helpful to give students more time to look and more time to think about what they see. So we are going to walk you through this set of routines, and we hope that we get into a really interesting and deep place with the understanding that there's more depth there. And in particular with this piece, we wanted to provide something that has a pretty serious nature and an artwork that can really help us dig deep into some issues that are important in our students' lives, are important in our lives as part of the DC community, and also can open up the sort of box of social justice and economic justice. So strap in. I'm going to hand it over to Ashley, who's going to talk a little bit about the amazing resource that we're using that's giving us access to this piece, the Learning Lab, which is a great set of resources and also a platform with a lot of tools. Ashley, would you like to share the Learning Lab?
Excellent. Thanks so much, Jaime. Sorry for kind of popping in and out.
Okay.
Oops, looks like we're having some connectivity issues. So I think Ashley will come back. So why don't we do this? I will go ahead and I will share my screen and you can drive me through it.
Okay. So our first piece, we're going to zoom in on a really small section.
Okay. Okay, I have to get myself set up 1 second. All right. Okay, we ready?
Yeah, can you zoom in for us?
Sure.
All right, so if we zoom in here, I'm gonna ask Jim a question. He's gonna respond, but also as you're thinking about the question, feel free to use the chat box and just share some of your thinking related to this prompt in the chat box as well. So Jim and everyone, what do you see when you look at this little slice of this artwork? What do you see?
The first thing that I see are a lot of lines.
Okay.
Some are straight and some are kind of a little wiggly.
Mm-hmm.
I see different, almost like boxes, rectangles and squares of varying colors and shades of a color.
Mm-hmm.
And I see red dots that are different shapes and in different locations. I don't really see a pattern with them, except that they're, again, they're sort of rectangular as well in most cases, but they don't seem to be fitting a pattern.
All right. Thank you. So now if everyone is taking a minute to just share what they see, what do you see in the chat box?
So we have 2 comments from Facebook. Heidi's seeing rectangles, gray lines, green shading, triangles. Back on YouTube, Carol is seeing greens, red taupes. Heidi on Facebook's also seeing smaller red rectangles. Back on YouTube, Anna Maria is seeing some sort of texture. Amy seeing linens, stitches, boxes of colors. Carol seeing red rectangles. Sarah Kelly, LA, is seeing divisions like on a map. Carol says she's seeing maybe fabrics. Catherine's noting muted colors and red splotches. Carol's also noticing a grid, like a street in America, again, a map, a bird view, torn silk. Jonathan's saying it almost seems like the darker rectangle may be a central location or a starting point. Carol's noticing it seems 3D.
Nice. There's a lot of detail to notice and a lot of geometry too.
Mm-hmm.
The next question is, what connections come to mind when you're thinking about what you see here? What connections are you making, and what do you think it might mean? What do you think this might mean? And Jim, do you want to start us off?
Sure, and the connections, I think some have already been named that I'm thinking too. Again, the idea of being a grid or a pattern, almost like a map. Certainly things extending from that central patch that Jonathan was noticing, that sort of greenish, that there are things extending from it. So it's almost as if that's a central place because there are different spokes on it. And then maybe there's some connection between the red spots because of the color and where they are.
Great. And in the chat on YouTube, we're getting some comments. Anna Maria says it looks like the planning of a town. Carol said it looks like farmland. Other Carol says patchwork. Amy says a map, a satellite view with red hotspots on a map. I think that's very timely. So we're talking about hotspots a lot now. Sarah Kelly LA says many of the shapes have smaller red rectangles. Georgina is making a connection to a map of Washington, D.C. Perhaps the red rectangles are special buildings. The green is a park. Carol also making a connection with blood with the red. Another Carol is asking if it's a sewn quilt. Another green for a park, saying this is not a happy place, which is interesting.
It's interesting. I'm hearing a lot of connections to like the design, like the sort of design vocabulary or the visual vocabulary of systems that we already know a little bit about. So we know from maps that green is usually a park, or we know from maps that red is usually a landmark or something dangerous. And there's also this vocabulary of color that we're drawing on. And the way that we know that roads work, particularly that roads work in DC. So there's a lot that we get just from zooming in on this tiny piece and kind of starting to think through what all these things could mean. We're going to zoom out to look at the whole quilt. Allison, if you can help us with that. And it is a quilt, which is another type of system too. So we're going to, in this zoomed out view, we're going to look at this piece, and we're going to use a protocol called voice and choice. On Monday, we used a protocol called the design hunt, which I really like to use as an entry point into considering the perspective of the artist and how we can hear their voice when we're sensitive to design, when we're practicing design sensitivity. Voice and choice adds another layer to the design hunt protocol, which is the consideration of other voices, including missing voices and maybe my own voice. This works well when we want to guide learners in thinking about how the content we're looking at will involve or impact people in different ways, or how the voice of the artist should be considered alongside other important perspectives. So the first part of voice and choice is consider the context. Where was the content made? When was it made? Who made it? What else is going on at this place and time? The nice thing about Learning Lab is that it provides, when we look at the resource in the information button, if you click on the information button, then it pulls out information about that resource. So we know just from the Learning Lab itself and the baked in resources that this is the Washington, DC foreclosure quilt, that it was created by Catherine Clark, who was born in Knoxville, Tennessee in 1971. And it has a description, which is that Clark began to make her foreclosure quilts in 2007 to document the effects of the economic recession on the American landscape. By 2015, the mortgage crisis had faded from the news, despite the ongoing distress of many homeowners. And Clark crafted this piece to keep the tragedy in the public eye. She chose quilting for its humble utilitarian value and domestic associations. Her quilts document actual foreclosures from neighborhoods across the country. So with that information about the context of this piece, the foreclosure quilt, the DC foreclosure quilt, we're going to run through the protocol, which starts with maker choices. And here we're going to, Jim is going to share an idea, but we're also going to open up the chat box for your ideas. What choices do you think the maker made when designing this content? And why do you think they made these choices? Do you have any ideas to share with us, Jim?
Yeah, so I think I'm thinking about a lot of choices. I'll start with one. One is that it doesn't represent all of Washington, D.C. So I think the artist had to make a choice about which part of DC would be depicted on the quilt. I also think that the choice of color was really important. So how to depict those different aspects that we see. I mean, it is this bird's eye view, as someone noted. So how do you make those pieces stand out that you want the viewer to draw attention to?
And some of the viewers on YouTube are commenting the same, and that the red color is obviously very deliberate. Dark red is a color of pain. The color red makes it seem more important or urgent. But we also have a comment that the medium is simple and barren. So there's a juxtaposition there. Jonathan says the maker had to make a choice of DC rather than another city, which was perhaps intentional to show it's affecting all parts of the country, even those closest literally to power. Some more comments about color, and the color makes it stand out. So it seems that the foreclosure homes are totally isolated in loneliness. From Carol.
So there's a lot of choices, especially when you're talking about places, right? And how to show something complex in a way that that is true to the medium, is true to the place, and says this thing that you want it to say. So we see all of those choices happening. The next question is about the voices that are present. And I think that for this section, if Jim and Ashley, if you can just share some ideas about the voices that are present, just to kind of move us into thinking that through. The prompt here is whose voices are present in this foreclosure quilt and whose perspectives are represented. Mm-hmm. So it sounds like we're saying the voice of the artist is present. We can see in their choices that voice is present. How can we characterize that voice a little bit? And what other voices might be present?
So it's an interesting question, and I think by the focus that we've had on thinking about the red and what the red represents and what it makes us do as we look at this, I think that there is an attempt to have the voice of these sites that are foreclosed upon represented. So the voices of people who own the homes or lived in the homes are represented by individualized pieces on the quilt.
I wonder if the voice of the organization making the foreclosures is represented because it's so targeted on the homes that those organizations, those banks are specifically targeting, is what we're really seeing.
Mm-hmm. And I really see this sort of very mainstream paradigm about maps, and also the sense that there is like a lot of data being represented, and the voice that maybe would speak data to us. But here's another. So the next prompt is whose voices are missing from this content? What perspectives are not represented, and why do you think that is?
Right.
So this one is about what voices are missing.
So I know a little bit about where this is depicted, and it is right near Capitol Hill, as someone was suggesting that it's Washington D.C. and it's close to power, but it's actually right abutting the Capitol in terms of what she chose to represent. So I think what's missing are the voices of people in power who might have put into place the kinds of policies that could have led to these foreclosures. They're not here, but mm-hmm. they're, I think, hovering around it in a sense.
Mm-hmm. There's also, I think, the voices of people who are outside of this small square.
Right.
DC is obviously bigger than this, so so that's a missing component, maybe.
Right, and it makes me wonder about other parts of the city. We know that DC, if anybody's from DC on the call, we know it's a very divided city in so many different ways, certainly socioeconomically and racially. And it just makes me wonder about other parts of the city. Did we see as much red in parts of Northwest or in parts of Northeast as we're seeing here? And so that those voices of other neighborhoods in DC are missing in this particular quilt.
Mm-hmm. I also see, and this is maybe a caveat because it's maybe something that wasn't really thought about. I don't see the perspective of children here, and what a way of seeing this or a way of making sense of this that would really be resonant with children or would reflect the experience of children.
Mm-hmm. And in that vein, I think the red represents a property. But there's much more to this than property. There are people's lives, children's lives, adults' lives, neighbors who live next to this property, all that. So there are those kinds of voices too that we don't get in it.
Well, and there's some interesting comments in the chat too that Carol's saying, even though the people who lost homes are represented, they're still nameless. So there's a concept that they're there, but maybe not necessarily their actual voices in there.
Mm-hmm.
There's a really interesting comment from Carol Mahoney. Says redlining in a different way. So that use of red conjures up this idea of redlining and exclusion that happens oftentimes in areas. Sarah, Senora Kelly La says, I wonder which races and cultures live in those areas. I don't know the area. So that idea of bringing in some of the cultural and socioeconomic politics, racial politics of DC might come into play.
And we know that these neighborhoods are different, right? That they're different in their demographics, and they're different in what they, the experience of moving through them. But the map sort of makes them the same in a way. There's some differentiation in the colors, but not in a way that tells us something about the sort of placeness of each place. So the next sort of set of questions is about my perspective. And for this part, if I will do, Jim's going to help us model, and then also I invite you to share your perspective in the chat. So the first question is my voice. What is your voice? What perspectives do you bring to this content?
So I have a very personal story in that I used to work on Capitol Hill before I moved into education. So I know this area, and I know how it's changed dramatically over the last 30 years. And I also come with an element of surprise upon first seeing it and knowing where it is, that there was so much foreclosure happening during that time in this particular neighborhood that has really surprised me. And then as a resident of Washington, D.C., I just think about what happened after this. I mean, what happened to these people's lives, and what about those people who had to foreclose on the people who were living in these properties? And so there's a whole narrative that's to take place after understanding the big consequences that come from the depiction of this time period.
Yeah, and I think along those lines on Facebook, Heidi is saying the voice from her voice of her knowledge of DC and being visually familiar with the map and the knowledge of this area's history, which kind of follows what Jim was saying.
The next question is my choice. So if you are going to redesign or reimagine this foreclosure quilt of DC to better represent your own perspective, what would you do? And why? How might it look differently? Maybe what do you think would stay the same?
It makes me think about the anonymizing that's happened with the red dots. We don't know who the people are. And so I'm wondering if there is a way to personalize each of those dots. That's what I'm interested in, the stories. So does it mean you have to zoom in even more and have just be able to tell a bit of the story to represent the larger story? So I'm thinking about how would I would want to personalize it in some way, like bring the human aspect into it.
Mm-hmm.
I find in some ways I'm struggling with how bland the rest of it is. Even the red seems bland to me. It doesn't seem, I don't know, colorful enough for what I remember the big emotions of that time. It seems really flat. I don't know.
There's interesting comments that are coming through. Senora Kelly La, again, with an interesting comment, I think that maybe you keep zooming out to see other parts of the country so that you connect it to that. And then other people are talking about what it would look like in my own setting. What would it look like in France? Or what would it look like in my hometown or something like that? So thinking about how it would compare to it. So doing it in another setting. How would you represent things?
And I wonder what would be richer or different if we sort of juxtaposed two different places or a set of different places. What would we learn about what that time looked like for different places?
There are also some comments that have come in both on both YouTube and Facebook about adding people, is getting to see the people somewhere, maybe all the people congregated in the center where you can see that they have a voice, or stitching them around to add that human element.
That's beautiful.
Stephanie has this beautiful comment, a what if quilt that represented actions that had been taken to show how many people could have kept their homes. Like what could have prevented all of these foreclosures from taking place?
The DC foreclosure quilt is one of the pieces that we, Jim and I, often turn to in the Making Across the Curriculum project to offer our learners an example of an object that's telling a very deliberate story and that involves a range of perspectives. We can also use it as an exemplar with our students to show our learners what maker empowerment might look like when it's coupled with design sensitivity, with real sensitivity to the systems we live in and around and how they impact human experiences. I'm excited about how the tools of Project Zero and Agency by Design help us think about the voices embedded in our artworks and designs and in the world around us. And this creates a lot of room for us to consider a pretty large range of artworks and artifacts in a large range of content areas and disciplines. One of the Ashley has helped, the Smithsonian has helped put together a collection that has a few different sets of resources. I wonder if we can just show everybody the collection.
Sure.
And in particular, keeping in mind that Making Across the Curriculum is an active research project, I've also included an example of a project that we've been working on as a really in-depth use of voice and choice. It's called Reimagining Confederate Monuments. It's a project with Making Across the Curriculum teacher that looks with high school history students, that looks specifically at artworks that feature Confederate leaders. We were heavily inspired by the work and thinking of Titus Kafar related to historical amendment in artworks, and thinking about how contemporary voices can intersect with historical artworks, and what we can and should do about that. So with students, we looked at this TED Talk from Titus Kafar about historical amendment in artwork. And then we had the students consider redesigning, among other things, a portrait of Robert E. Lee that was from the Learning Lab. We were very grateful to get a very high resolution images from this exact webpage. And we challenged the students using voice and choice to redesign this portrait to show a fuller story that included more perspectives, and some of them contemporary perspectives, about Robert E. Lee and his legacy. Ashley, if I can hand it over to you to share a little bit more about the full collection.
Sure. And thanks so much, Jaime. It was fun to listen in on this session, and I apologize for any connectivity issues at the beginning, but I'm excited to share the Smithsonian Learning Lab collection that accompanies this session. So for each of the Easy Peasy sessions, what we've done is curated a series of resources that not only demonstrate the things that we've talked about today in the half-hour session, but also how you might extend your own learning, teaching and learning around this topic. So for example, here are the two routines that Jaime used, which is Zoom in and the protocol Voice and Choice. Here's the original artwork, and you can see it's from the American Art Museum. There's also a video that gives a little bit more context about Project Zero thinking routines more broadly and the types of thinking and understanding that they support. There is a website from the artist Catherine Clark, so you can actually access additional quilts that are part of this series too, to learn more about her process. There's also a wonderful article too about how quilting can actually help explain this foreclosure crisis too. And so it just brings in, again, another perspective through the article too, of kind of hearing the artist's choices as well. This unfortunately doesn't screen preview quite as well as I would love for it to do. But what I wanted to mention about this specific resource, and we can click on it here if you'd like. But basically, this is a resource that looks at the displacement of Meridian Hill, which is a neighborhood specifically in Washington, D.C., the displacement of the African American community there. And so as you start to think about ways to pair both museum resources with contemporary resources, that might be an interesting model to follow. Finally, Jim and the team, Jaime as well, have been thinking about what other museum resources we could pair with this specific routine. And so again, you saw the specific project that Jaime was talking about, inspired by the artist Titus Kafar, and thinking about art amending history. There's the Robert E. Lee original portrait that she was talking about. And also I wanted to point out that this is a CC0 image. So it's part of the public domain and part of the Smithsonian's open access, meaning that you can remix, share, and really kind of think about reimagining some of these artworks. And there's more information on open access in that 0 button right there. And then this is, again, some student work. Then we also chose a few artworks and artifacts from across the Smithsonian where voice and choice might bring in a new perspective as you're looking closely at the specific artworks. There's also a video about an artist who's thinking about, quote unquote, disrupting craft too, from the Renwick Gallery here at the Smithsonian. This specific resource is also looking at the famous kind of George Washington crossing the Delaware, but it's been reimagined by artists over time. So everything from George Washington Carver crossing the Delaware to Roger Shimamura crossing the Delaware. And he's a Asian American artist who has often kind of put himself into kind of key historical moments. And so this is looking across those artworks as well. And I think an interesting series to start to kind of pair with voice and choice. There's also some resources from the Hirshhorn. Amendment number 8 is an artwork by Mark Bradford. And as you look into the information tab of this resource, you'll see too that while this is kind of an interesting piece, it really kind of hones in on the Constitution, specifically the first 10 amendments, and thinking through the ways that the artwork also can kind of help identify some of the ways that freedoms guaranteed by the Constitution are not always upheld. This is an artist interview with Mark Bradford, a video of a home art challenge. So I'm sure you've all seen across social media lots of different art challenges from the Getty Museum, for example, and others, but really helping students actually become the portrait or become the artwork and starting to think about their perspective and their voice and choice too. So again, just some great examples of ways you could extend this resource beyond. And then continuing on with kind of a look at our local DC community, there's a statue in a local neighborhood called Lincoln Park. And this is kind of an essay outlining how a teacher started to work with her students to reimagine what that might look like. Finally, this session is archived. So if you missed even just the first few minutes of the session, or you want to go back and see some of those key questions and the ways that Jaime beautifully kind of facilitated this routine, you can always view this session's archive. There's also more information about the online course that's available online from Project 02. So if you want to deepen your experience with these routines, all of these resources are available to you through the Smithsonian Learning Lab. And you can find this link if you search Easy Peasy in the chat box in the Smithsonian Learning Lab. Or you can also, in the description of this YouTube video at the bottom, you'll see a link to these resources as well. I'll turn it over to you, Allison.
Great. Thank you so much, everyone who's joined us and participated. If you have any questions to follow up, you can feel free to email us at learning@si.edu. We'll make sure that your question gets routed and gets answered. I wanted to also thank Jaime for joining us this week. We have really enjoyed having you, and I know I personally have really learned a lot and really am thinking about these things in a different way, so thank you. We will be back with another Easy Peasy next Monday at 1 o'clock, and we very much hope to see all of you there. Thank you so much for joining us.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.